for the rest of y'all that haven't seen it before, this is a set of ideas that, while it was put together for one particular town, actually applies very broadly. And everybody else can be asking some of these same questions. You just need to calibrate it for where you are, because obviously what the particulars of Lafayette aren't necessarily your particulars, but y'all have very comparable things wherever it is that you live. I'm completely confident of that. Everybody has some of the same things. Actually, earlier today when we were here to the part about the nighttime management, that presentation, I texted Wanda 2 or 3 times and I said, this sounds exactly like what our problems are on South Beach right now. So we had exactly, I mean, every word for word, everything that was in that presentation was what we're experiencing right now, trying to have to figure out a way to deal with. So our problems are more similar than they are different. Just calibrate it for your place. For a very long time, actually for the entire history of the Industrial Revolution, the way that cities competed, they competed in certain ways to attract talent and to retain talent. And I'll talk about what some of those things were in just a moment. And of course, obviously, if you want to do that, then you really need to, this is kind of just really basic stuff, but you really need to, first of all, build on your strengths and then figure out what the weaknesses are and try to remedy those. Now, the old economic drivers for the entire history of the Industrial Revolution, and really before that, but so we're talking about, what we're talking about right now that we're undergoing at this moment, and I think that we're very privileged to be living at this time, but these are actually the biggest changes that humanity has seen in 250 years, at least, in my opinion, and some people would say that it's actually the biggest change in about 1,000 years. But whatever the case, it's a very long time. And so the old drivers were, where are your natural resources? Do you have iron in the hills, or is there coal in the hills, or whatever the case may be? Do you happen to, are you living on a river? Can you ship stuff upriver or downriver, like obviously happens right out here? Or are you at an intersection of highways, of major highways, where you can start a trading post and it may turn into eventually a great city? Or of course, are you on the shore of an ocean where you can ship to other countries? And so these are some of the things that drove the economics of a place for a very long time. Now, the new economic driver is actually the cool factor. It's do you have a cool place like this that people actually want to come to, or are you stuck, as we heard before, out in the office park somewhere that nobody wants to be? And so, for the first time, really in human history, people are choosing where they live, not by the jobs that they can get, but by the character of the place. People are saying, I want to move to Portland, I want to move to New Orleans, I want to move to Austin, wherever it is, and then I'll find a job, because it's the character of the place that's driving me to go there, because I know there'll be jobs there, there'll be things that I can do, and this has never happened before. People have always followed the jobs, or followed, before that they followed the herds, or they followed the whatever it is that they were hunting for, or whatever the case might be. Now, in Lafayette, or actually the whole Acadiana region, some of the greatest strengths, of course, are obviously the culture is the greatest single strength, and of course that's composed of not only the food. Actually, you think about things like gumbo and beans and rice and stuff like that, but the fact of the matter is it's what exists all over Acadiana actually is a very vibrant living tradition, where they are coming up with new stuff all the time that is a part of the tradition of Creole cuisine and so forth, but that doesn't look like anything that you would think of if you walk, if you were to say, well, I just want to come down here and have some of the local cuisine, because that's something that this particular chef just came up with. Obviously, the music is a big deal as well. But if you look at the greatest weakness in the area, now I'm showing this picture, and some of y'all that happen to be from Lafayette probably know where that is, but it really doesn't matter, because it could be anywhere in America. Y'all all know that. And when I say America, even further than the U.S., you have stuff in Canada that looks just like this, I'm completely certain. And so most of the places that anywhere in North America, and increasing around the world, the physical environment is not worthy of the culture of the place, especially in a place like this, with such a high level of culture, of musical culture and culinary culture. This is simply not worthy of that. It's like, how did this happen? You know, how did people that care so much about the culture let something like this get built? Of course, we know what the answer is, and that is it's the prepackaged solution that we've had for sprawl all over, that's got rammed down all of our throats, you know, all over the country. So it's not y'all's fault in particular in Lafayette. We've let this happen to us all over the place. Interestingly enough, in Acadiana, at the rural and the suburban levels, at those levels of the transect, there's actually some very good solutions for what to do about architecture that are incredibly attuned to the regional conditions and climate and culture. Okay, this is perfect for a little farmhouse out on the countryside. But actually, when you go downtown, what you find is that unlike in the country or in the suburban parts of the transect, that, okay, look, this is technically, it's called American mercantile architecture. Okay, it's kind of a stretch to say it really falls under any stylistic category. It's just kind of, okay, I'm going to offend y'all, but I mean, it's just architecturally it's cheap junk, and unfortunately we have cheap junk all over the country, so don't feel alone on that. Okay, but at best it's unremarkable, but really it could be anywhere in the country. There is nothing about this that says anything about the culture of the people that created this. I'm not even calling it architecture, it's just construction. And like I say, it could be anywhere. But there's another category of place that's out there that I call the most loved places. These are the places that we valued the most and loved the longest. And this happens all over the world. It's not just the most loved places in the U.S. This obviously is Paris, clearly. But one thing about the most loved places, almost inevitably, it happens in every single case I can think of. When you go to one of them, you know where you are. You know, it's not like it's anywhere USA or anywhere Europe or whatever the case might be. You know, there's no shadow of a doubt that when you're looking at this image here, that if you've ever been to Paris, you know you're in Paris. Even if you haven't been there, you've seen it in the pictures, that you know where that is. Now, I'm going to show you some examples here that are smaller, and then I want to talk about some of the characteristics of these most loved places. If you look at this image, you say, well, that's got to be a little English village somewhere. And a lot of people say, well, that's probably in the Cotswolds. And some people even say, well, is it Bourton-on-the-Water? And of course it is. If you look at this image, there's nobody that's been a U.S. citizen for more than 6 months that can't, out of the entire face of the earth, narrow down to exactly 1 square mile where that is. There's no doubt, okay? Everybody knows. If you look at this, this is my hometown now. There's no shadow of a doubt that that's South Beach. I mean, that's just, it's clear. And then if you look at this image, everyone will say, well, that's got to be an Italian hill town. A lot of people ask, is that in Tuscany? And some will even say, is that Pienza? And of course it is. Now, a couple of things you'll notice about this. First of all, in all of these images, in every image, every building is different. There's no two buildings exactly alike. Okay? You look down this street here. You know, they're similar, but they're not exactly alike. You know? But while there's a great variety, that great variety occurs in a very narrow range. Okay? Because they are so similar, what that amounts to, the great variety gives it life. Okay? If it were all the same, people would say, you know, the common refrain out there is, oh, that's cookie cutter. You know, it's just like a production line. You just go down the assembly line creating stuff, and so that has no life. Okay? But it's the narrow range that gives it character, because that's why you can say, I know where I am. It's like, now let me say this, nature does it best. If you look at any room full of humans, okay, if you look out over the room, there's no shadow of a doubt that we're all different. Even if you have identical twins that are like 35 or 40 years old, you can tell the difference between them because, you know, they kind of change as they go through life. But there's also no doubt, looking out across this room, that there's no horses in the room. There's not a hippopotamus in the room. There's not a snake or an eel or an eagle or salamander, you know, we're all humans, okay? Because it is that narrow range, it leaves no doubt that we're all of the same species. And so nature does it the very best. Now, the problem that we've had in recent times, in speaking as a new urbanist, we've been trying to figure this stuff out for, 35 years now, I guess. And the problem that we have, we know how to reduce the range to 0. We just say, here's the approved details, use these, okay? But we get charged many times with designing cookie cutter places. People will say that, and when you have just the approved details and that's it, then, you know, they're kind of right. Because it does look like it's something coming off a production line. There's also no secret in having great variety. You just say it's a free-for-all, do whatever you want to. That's what every architect out there, and I'm speaking as an architect so I can give them a hard time. You know, if I wasn't one, you couldn't give them a hard time that well. But since I am one, well, at least in the state of Florida, in the state of Alabama, state of Mississippi. I'm not an architect in Louisiana. But anyhow, as one in those other states, anyway, I can say this, that every architect says, give me ultimate freedom. Who are you to put chains on me where I can't design what I want to design? The problem is, when you do that, when you have ultimate freedom, then it could be anywhere. You have no idea where it is. As a matter of fact, there is a new urbanist place that was built in Orlando by Disney. It's a town of celebration that I'm often, and again, we critique each other ferociously in the interest of getting better. But I have for a very long time said that celebration is a mistake that we had to make to know that it was a mistake, to know how big of a mistake it was. Because I can show you picture after picture of streetscapes in celebration where you say, well, okay, there's a Greek Revival, there's a Queen Anne Victorian, oh, maybe there's even an Art Deco building, here's a Federal building, here's Spanish Colonial. It's like, that could be anywhere. The only clue that it's in the subtropics is the palm trees on the street. That's a street tree. Other than that, you would have no idea where you were in the United States because it's a free-for-all stylistically. It's a collection of styles that people happen to like, but you throw them all together and it could be anywhere USA. And so the trick is how do you actually create that great variety in the narrow range? Okay? We haven't actually solved that problem that well. Or I said we're self-critical. We're trying to figure out how to get better. Okay, so that's one that we haven't solved that well, in part because we tried to keep such a tight lid on the quality of the architecture because it's been so abysmal, you know, recently. You know, just regular production builder stuff from the 1960s and 1970s was just some of the, I call it the dark ages of architecture. It's some of the worst architecture ever built in human history. And so we've said, well, let's have a higher standard. Let's keep a tight rein on things. But in doing so, you know, then we produce these things that either have the great variety or the narrow range, but not both. There is a mechanism I'm going to talk about more towards the end of the presentation. It's something I call a living tradition. It's where, unlike what most of my business is, and quite frankly what that is, I have for years written architectural codes. I also serve as a town architect in a lot of places. Now, what a town architect is, if you're not familiar with that term, is somebody who reviews other people's drawings. So I'll come in for a day in say, Lost Rabbit over in Jackson, Mississippi, and I'll review maybe 20 plans or something like that. And so the idea is to help all the other architects and designers get their plans better. And then I'll leave, and then they'll get the things built, and I'll come back the next month and so forth. And so my whole career, or most of my career over the last 10 years or so, has been about trying to raise that bar. So I'm one of the guilty parties of you know, not creating this great variety in the narrow range. But I've finally figured it out, I think, of actually how you go about that. And I'm going to talk about that at the end of the presentation in more detail. What this goes back to, and the kind of the atomic elements, if you will, of what we deal with in a way that will actually get the job done, as I'll talk about at the end, is what is known as a language of patterns. Now, if you're familiar with Christopher Alexander, that wrote a pattern language back in the 1970s, and before that, the Timeless Way of Building, then that's where the terminology comes from. And it was absolutely groundbreaking work. If you're not familiar with it, right after I met Andres for the first time, back in, I guess it's the late 90s or something like that, I asked him, I said, I'm just curious what you think about a pattern language. He said, I consider it to be the Bible of the new urbanism. It's that important. You should read that before you read anything else. Anyhow, if you haven't read that book, you really ought to read it, and then you'll see more of what I'm talking about. But anyhow, so I'm just cluing you in on where that comes from. But basically the idea is that a pattern, an individual pattern is, how do you make a railing? How do you support a balcony? How do you shut a window? How do you create the eave and all these things? In other words, it's individual little single things of how you build that you, and here's the interesting thing, when you're talking about things on the level of style, style is very much like religion. It is a complex set of ideas that is too complex to be talked about one little piece at a time. And so if you're talking about one or the other, you either believe or you don't believe. If you want to talk about Art Deco, Greek Revival, you either like it or you don't. Okay, but if we can get down to talking about individual patterns, for this climate and conditions and culture, how do you actually make that eave? What's the best way of making an eave in a place like this that has heat and humidity and hurricanes? And we can have an intelligent conversation about that, but we can't have an intelligent conversation about style because it's just too big and too complex of a set of ideas to talk about as a whole. You really have to break it down into those individual patterns to make sense. Some of those patterns have mainly to do with the function, either the function of the street or of the building, and how that, for example, how just the pattern of setting the table and chairs out in front of this little restaurant in Paris. That's a pattern repeated many times all over the city and in other cities as well, obviously even including here, especially including here actually, and so that's primarily a functional pattern. Then you can have patterns that primarily address the climate. For example, all of the galleries here that will shade people, or also will shield you from the water. Those are things that are primarily about the climate. And then there's also patterns that are about the culture. And now this photo was actually taken in Havana. I was walking through the city, and this woman, she smiled at me, and I took her picture, and she gave me a thumbs up, so I guess it's okay to use it. I didn't speak a word of Spanish, so I had no clue, but anyhow, she waved at me, and so I guess it's all good. But like her, culture in Acadiana is a very warm and inviting thing. People aren't standoffish. They're more likely to talk to you than they are to turn away from you. So the architectural patterns should also reflect that culture as well, not just the climate and the regional conditions. Tradition is actually I should have warned you, any architects in the room, that I was about to drop the T word on you. People worry about dropping the F-bomb. Well, architects have a big problem with the T-bomb because they don't quite know how to deal with it. The problem is that for about the last 100 years or so, there have been no living traditions in America, which means that everyone living today has not lived as part of a living tradition of architecture and urbanism. Now, there's vibrant living traditions in other things. For example, the blogosphere is a very vibrant living tradition that has sprung up just in the last 10 years or so. Today, millions of people participate every day around the world. Tens or even hundreds of millions of people actually read their work. Okay, so you have the bloggers and the people reading the blogs. So that's a very vibrant, self-organizing living tradition that sprung up. So humans, post-industrial humans, are definitely capable of it. We're just not doing it yet in architecture and in urbanism. It's kind of like the ways of regulating now are akin to the old mainframe computers. It all goes back to Design Central, if you will, or whatever. And like where I'm town architect, that's sort of me, But a living tradition actually is sort of like the internet because it downloads things to many people. The idea of a living tradition is that everyone participates. The old proposition of an architectural pattern book was that thou shalt do this because I have better taste than you. Okay. Now people sometimes comply with that, but nobody likes it. But the basic proposition of actually I'll tell you how I came about the basic proposition of a living tradition. The day after Thanksgiving 1980, my wife Wanda, sitting here in the front row, my sister who's not here, and her boyfriend at the time who's definitely not here, and we'd had too much turkey from the day before, and we said, well, let's go walk. And well, where shall we walk? Well, I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, and that was a town that was built almost entirely since World War II, so it was all sprawl. So there's nowhere to walk there. So we drove 20 miles to Mooresville, Alabama, a little hamlet, so we could walk. It's like people, driving to the gym so they can walk on the treadmill, and so that was us. But in walking around that town for like 3 hours, photographing every building, it's actually just a hamlet. It's only 3 blocks by 3 blocks, so 9 square blocks. But in photographing everything, I was amazed and had a huge question, because we'd been told by our professors that we're going to be the greatest generation of architects ever. They said, hey, you guys have computers now. And your builders, man, they have bigger power tools, And the mortgage companies, they have more clever mortgages. Of course, we know how that worked out, in 2008. But still, basically the proposition was, because you have better tools, you will be better. But in Mooresville, here's a little place that actually was settled in 1818, 40 years before an architect ever set foot in the state of Alabama. Okay, it's a bunch of simple farmers and tradespeople, but they had built a better place than any specialist had built since the end of World War II. Now this is 1980, so seaside was just getting designed then, and so this is before all the new urbanism. But they built a better place than all the specialists could. So how is it possible that a bunch of uneducated, probably illiterate for the most part, farmers and tradespeople could do better than what the specialists could all do, in modern times, since the end of World War II? That was a great mystery. I had no clue how that could happen. But I'll tell you what the even bigger mystery was. You can see how once some brilliant person comes somewhere and gets something started, how people can keep it going for a while. But the real big mystery is, how do you transmit that wisdom down to the next generation so they can carry it on? Now, all through history of townspeople building great towns with no Imagineers from Disney, I mean, think of all the little Italian hill towns. There was no Imagineer there. It was the townspeople building the town. Okay, and so in all that history, how did they pass this down? There was no written codes or anything that they handed down. So what could it have been? I thought for years it must have been something mystical that regular post-industrial humans like us couldn't possibly understand. Okay, what I found out instead, it was something very different. We had in July 20, well, in the middle of July of 2004, we had a charrette at a place called Lost Rabbit in Jackson, Mississippi, to design this new town. And July 24th was the end of the charrette. We had the final celebratory dinner. We were all in the parlor of the Millsaps Bowie House. There was a B&B at the time, where we were staying, saying our final goodbyes before we went to bed, and we're all going to go separate ways in the morning. Someone asked Milton Grenfell, who was originally from Mississippi, lives in D.C. now, but he's an architect, and they asked him, said, Milton, why do you have all these bell-cast eaves here? It comes down and it kicks out at the bottom. He said, well, we do this because that here you need a roof that's steep enough that it doesn't fail an uplift in a hurricane, but shallow enough that it doesn't fail an overturning. So kind of the sweet spot's about an 8 and 12, 9 and 12. But with the roof that steep, with the torrential rains that we have, water comes off in a sheet and it'll dig a trench in the yard. And so when you put the little kick out on it, then it comes off in more of a spray than a sheet, and it actually saves the yard. It took a minute. I said, wait a minute now. What did he say? What did he say? We do this because. That's it. That's it. That's the key I'd been looking for all those years, to try to explain how this stuff got transmitted down. If you put every pattern in the language of architecture into those terms, we do this because, where you tell everybody why we do what we do, instead of thou shalt do this because I know better than you, or I'm smarter, or whatever, or I, got better taste, whatever the proposition is. If you put it in those terms, then you allow everyone to think again. All the modernists that are really pissed off about the pattern books that are tying their hands, well, they really are. Guess what? They are tying their hands. They're saying, you got to do it like this. But when you say, here's the principle, then you break the shackles free, and they're allowed to think again, as long as it's within the principle. So it's a principle-based thing, not a style-based thing. And so that's the real key, I believe, to a living tradition that actually fosters life in architecture again. For the first time in 100 years, architecture can actually take on a life of its own and begin to evolve again, as it's always done from the dawn of time until about 1920, when we quit having evolving life and began having just a series of little personal architectural revolutions. Okay, so it's a really, really important thing. I mentioned before about patterns versus styles, but basically what it comes down to is if you're talking about a style as a whole, or politics as a party, or a religion as a whole, or any of these things that are big complex sets of ideas, they're very blunt instruments. But if you can turn it into a discourse on actual patterns, one pattern at a time, then we can all talk intelligently, and we'll probably leave the room as friends, as opposed to having religious wars or whatever, or architectural style wars, or whatever the case may be, over these things. There's a set of, well, let me talk to you about patterns. The first realm of patterns, or personal patterns. If anybody that knows architecture looks at this image, they'll say, well, that's got to be a Frank Gehry building, and of course it is. Now, the problem with first realm patterns, when they're identified with one particular architect or designer, is that they cannot strictly be said to be living things, because when that architect or designer or originator or whatever they are dies, then that pattern dies with them and does not continue on. However, just as soon as it resonates with other people, then it moves on to the second realm of the local patterns, and then it does take on a life of its own, and that person can die and the thing will be continued on. I have no idea who came up with the Charleston single house, or that's what they call it there. Everywhere else in the country we call it the Charleston side yard. So somebody a few hundred years ago came up with this pattern, and it resonated with people in Charleston. They started building a lot of it. Interestingly enough, about, well, I don't know, maybe it's close to 30 years ago now, DPZ picked up on that pattern, and they said, you know what, this thing is, tell you what, I'm going to just do it the old way, the tech thing again. And they said, hey, the way that those porches are arranged with the house, that makes sense in Seaside as well. And so they decanted that pattern from Charleston to Seaside. And so it moved from the second realm to the third realm, which are the regional patterns. Okay? And now the third realm is where most of the patterns of sustainability exist, because that's where you're dealing with the regional conditions in climate and culture. Interestingly enough, just in the last few years, there's been people in other parts of the U.S., not the Deep South, that have said, hey, like for example, there's one development up in Michigan where they said, well, you know, it's a little cooler up here, but in the summer, the summer breezes come from basically the same direction. The winter winds come from basically the same direction. We still need to be long east to west. We're not so far north that we need to be just a very compact house. This makes sense for us too, this pattern. And so that pattern has now moved just in our lifetimes from the second realm to the third realm to the fourth realm of national patterns. The fifth realm is the highest level at which any architect can elevate a pattern, and it's what I call the continental heritage. And so, like for example, most of the patterns of Western classicism reside there. Now, the continental heritage, if you go to China, for example, their highest and most refined stuff looks very different from this. It's not the same thing at all because it's in a very different place. The sixth realm patterns are the universal patterns that do not change. Like the shape and arrangement of the human body, things like that. Wherever you go on earth, if you see someone smile or someone laugh, you don't need an interpreter to know that they're pleased about something. Okay, so these things are universal all the way around the world. Now, let's look at patterns a different way, how they evolve. Beginning here at Seaside, this was the very first building in Seaside that was designed for Seaside. There was one earlier building. There was a little sharecropper's cottage that got brought in from like 30 miles away, but this is the first one designed here. And so over time, it got to the point where they had, after about 10 years, fully recovered the local traditions or regional traditions, and actually some of this is even national and beyond. But so at this point, they could do, 10 years later, they could do a competent traditional building again. You know, this is really crude. This little cottage here is really crude. But then after that, as you look at it, over time for another 10 or 15 years, it turned into some things that were never anticipated before by anybody way back then. Okay? So this is something that took on a life of its own and developed into some very interesting things that could not have been anticipated before. It's very, I call it a living tradition. It's very much like other aspects of life. If you have a child, you don't really know what they're going to turn into when they grow up. You know, you kind of hope to guide them along the way and stuff, but you can't know from, if you've had anybody as old as teenagers, I had some of those a few years ago, and you discover very quickly then that they may be something very different from what you ever anticipated, and architecture can do the same thing. Now, interestingly enough, there's a number of places in the U.S. that have done what I call extreme makeovers. They have decided at some point in time that we want to change the character. We want to change all this whole collection of patterns of how we build to a whole collection of different patterns that will kind of, in today's terms, will rebrand us as something different. In Santa Fe, New Mexico, which this is, I don't know if you all know this or not, but prior to, I think it was 1908, 1910, somewhere in that vicinity, when they consciously made this decision, there it was the business community that made the decision to rebrand. They were just another little railroad Victorian town, little Victorian cottages like you'd see, you know, all over the country, that were pre-cut somewhere else and shipped out on the railroad. That's what they looked like until they made the decision to know, let's go adobe. And so they completely remade themselves in that very different character as a conscious decision to increase real estate value. It's all about value. It's like, look, if we're like everywhere else, you know, why are we any more valuable than anywhere else? Okay, but if we're a very special place to come to, that's not like just everywhere else, then we may have actually more value than what we would, the real estate that is, you know, if we just remain just completely ordinary. Now there's another one, another town that decided that as well, and that was Santa Barbara. Now there it was driven by the design community as opposed to the business community, so it can work either way. You're not tied into it having to be one way or the other. But in Santa Barbara, if the design community said, let's rebrand this place, and so it was, so they were the ones that spearheaded that. Now, there's also places that develop the local character actually from the beginning. And for example, where I live in South Beach, which is what this is, from the very beginning it began as an art, well, almost the very beginning. There were some little coral houses with clay tile roofs, you know, like a few dozen of them at the very, very beginning. But very quickly, Art Deco caught on. And so just like in Tel Aviv in Israel, that Art Deco became, from the very early times of the town, became the predominant character of the place. Coral Gables did a very interesting thing just a few miles away from South Beach, and that is, at the beginning they said, hey, we're going to seed several different characters of architecture here. We don't know what's going to be successful. You know, there was what they call the Dutch Colonial Village, which is where Andres and Liz live, and there was the Chinese village, believe it or not. You know, there's the French village, and there were like 7 villages, I think. The one that really took off and that really resonated and people continued to build was the Mediterranean Colonial Village, and so that was or Mediterranean Revival, I guess you'd say. And so that's the one that actually got picked up. But at the beginning, they did not know. They said, let's give people a choice and see what they choose. We can't know until we try it, and so that's how they did it. In other cases, this is the Kroger's in Madison, Mississippi. It's driven by the municipality. The mayor here has a very strong hand. She has for, I guess, 30 years now, has directed design in a very classical way. They have the most classical Texaco you've ever seen. Okay, I mean, and so she doesn't leave anybody out. It's like, it doesn't matter if you're talking about the gas station or whatever, it becomes very classical over time. So that's another way of going about it as well. Now the question that I asked to the folks in Lafayette, I said, you know, so far as regional conditions and climate and culture, you know, why not use the French Quarter as your model? I mean, it's nearby. It's been percolating with all these ideas for, you know, centuries now. They've really refined stuff quite a lot. But the problem is, well, there's a couple of problems. Number one, it's not exactly the same thing. You know, the conditions in climate are very similar. The culture is quite similar, but they're not exactly the same. The other thing is, too, to think about, if they said, we want to be French Quarter Junior over here, starting now, then for at least all of our lifetimes, it might be kind of a mirror of that in some ways, but it would always be lesser. There's no way that in our lifetimes that you're going to develop the kind of patina and character and local traditions and all this that have happened over here over a period of centuries. And so the thought is that, you know, if you're over here in Lafayette, then while it may be very similar, it should not be exactly the same thing. And keep in mind, This is your choice. To every community out there, I'm not just talking about Lafayette, but this is your choice. Like Santa Fe, that did an extreme makeover, how you characterize yourselves, the character you create, there's nothing preordained about that. It is your choice to make of what do we want to be. Okay, and so it's kind of a very important point in your history, I feel like, to be at the brink of making a choice like that or not. You know, you could say, well, we don't want to change anything. We're fine the way we are. We'll just continue like we have been. And that is a choice, is to say do nothing. Okay? If you want things to continue exactly as they have, then do nothing. But I would extremely suggest that public realm is not worthy of your culture. But anyhow, talking about tradition again, you know, you say, well, what's the difference between that and a habit? Well, you know, a habit is something you do repeatedly. Okay, you just repeat it over and over, maybe every day, maybe every hour, or whatever the habit is. Whereas a tradition is something we do repeatedly, but because we love to. Okay, so the important thing here is whatever you choose to do, if you choose to recharacterize or rebrand yourselves, it needs to be something that there's a good chance that the people can love. Okay, if you say, well, we want to be this weird, funky, crazy thing that only us architects can love, you know, then the chances of that actually, catching on and carrying on is actually pretty low. So it needs to be something that people can love. Let's take a look at living traditions in two ways. I told you before about the idea of things that get picked up because they resonate, but they begin by a single insight by one person. Aha, I have a better way of building a roof for this climate, or an eave for this climate and conditions and culture, or whatever. And then if they resonate, then they get repeated locally, and so it becomes a local tradition, moving to the second realm like we talked about. And then once there's a body of work like the single house, or the side yard house in Charleston, that is developed over time, then what sometimes happens, not all the time, but it can, is that people within the region around that locality say, we love this thing, we want to adopt it into our family of regional traditions, and so they do, moving into the third realm. Showing, by the way, that which is traditional has nothing to do with history, it is simply that which is most worthy of love. Okay, a very, very important distinction to make. You know, people think that tradition is about history. It's not about history, it's about what is lovable, what can be loved. Okay, here's another way of getting to the exact same thing. It begins by that same insight by one person about how to do something better. You know, whatever that thing is that is better. If the person can then, because of conviction and energy and perseverance, if they can transmit that idea to a hive of like-minded individuals, then that they pick it up, then the thing actually becomes a cause. If it transmits beyond that hive to the culture at large, then it actually becomes a movement. And then if it crosses generational boundaries and continues over time, then it reaches that highest level of ideas that spread, and that is of a living tradition. So that's two ways of thinking about it, to get from the exact same starting point to the exact same ending point, because they are the same thing. As I mentioned, as I mentioned before, you know, we don't have the experience of, none of us, of living in a living architectural tradition or a tradition of urbanism. And actually the living traditions all died roughly about close to 100 years ago. Matter of fact, I would maintain that the last living tradition to die in the United States was actually Art Deco on South Beach. I may be living, Wanda and I, in one of the very last Art Deco buildings ever built, right before the tradition died at the end of World War II. But that was the very last one. And so, causing, therefore, this huge misunderstanding of what the T word really means. Now, if you look at these two images, this was once a living creature. This is now a living creature. They're different species, of course, obviously. That's my dog Buddy, and that's some kind of sea creature that once lived but is no longer alive. But there is as much similarity between a living tradition and a dead tradition as there is between a living creature and a fossil. Okay, they both have particular forms and all this, and they all both once had life, but one is now alive, the other one no longer is, and so they're very, very different things. So don't get confused about dead traditions. It's a completely different thing. I mentioned earlier about the blogosphere, that this is a worldwide diagram of the blogosphere, a vibrant living tradition that sprung up just in the last 10 years. Now, when you start studying traditions, there's 3 levels of it. The first kind of entry level, this is 101, is thinking about it in terms of style. And all of us kind of began that way. You know, we said, well, hey, we got to understand something about how the old folks made things that were so lovable. Let's just trace one of these buildings. You know, I can do that. I've got a good eye, and I can look at it. And actually, I found out it didn't have as good of an eye as I thought it did until I practiced it quite a bit. But then the second level, and this is something DPZ always does when they go into to do a new charrette, and they go out and study the local traditions, the history, but they say, what are the design principles that created that? Okay, so that's a higher level of discourse, because you're beginning to understand what it is, why it was that the people did what they did. But the highest thing is, because see, this only makes the architects better and the designers better. But if you actually create a living vernacular tradition, that makes all the people better. Everybody can participate. You know, whether you be a homeowner or a designer or a builder, whatever you are, you know, you can all participate in a true living tradition, because that's something that goes the culture at large. And actually, I'd forgotten I had the slide in here. That was a story about us going to Mooresville. This is the best building in Mooresville. Obviously, we built far better buildings than that since the end of World War II in the U.S., but we hadn't built a better place. But anyhow, I'd forgotten I had that slide in there. Okay, so there's and one cool thing too about the recent years that we've relearned how to do is to actually get together in a collegial way, get a lot of designers in the same room and actually work on stuff together. That's something that we hadn't done in a very long time, since about the 1920s for the most part. And there's a few little exceptions, but not most. But the point of this slide is to say that you can have civic-minded designers in a place that agree to act collegially and not be the backstabbers that most of us architects are. And I'm saying that as one of them, okay? Okay, so I can say that. But we actually can work together again. Actually, you know, here's a funny thing. People don't realize this, but all of the Starchitects, you might call them, of the late 19th century, they actually were all friends and worked on stuff together, and they even traveled together. There was one time that a bunch of them were in Rome, and they said, well, oh, Stanford White is lost. Where is he? And I don't know. And but Daniel Burnham, he said, well, I know exactly where he is. I bet you he's in the Piazza del Popolo at the foot of the obelisk, looking down those 3 avenues. And they went there, and sure enough, there it was. So they knew each other well. They cooperated together, and they actually got amazing things done when it wasn't just one of them working at a time. And so you can have a group of civic-minded designers that can say, yes, we will choose to do this for our place. We will be the ones that will lead this charge to actually recharacterize or rebrand our place with a different character that we think will create greater value. Okay, so that's one way of going about it. And Jeff has actually thrown out. He's kind of thrown out the first, thrown down the first gauntlet of a set of ideas for what he's calling Art Zydeco. Now, my challenge to the designers there was, look, that's the starting point. It's not the ending point. And so, you know, you guys need to join the discussion. You need to put out your own proposals, and you can come together and be kind of similar to what the Sarasota School was in Florida in the 1950s. It was a group of people working together to create a similar character of architecture. You know, and they could have the Lafayette School. You know, I mean, it could be, when I say school, it's not a school where you teach people. It's the other kind of school where it's people that are coming together to create a similar thing. Or you can also do it, as I said before, you can do it with civic leaders of various sorts, whether it's like a mayor, or whether there's some other, there could be a preservation champion, like we've had in South Beach, that has preserved what we created all those years ago. You know, it could be other characters within the ecosystem of the city that they say, I'm going to take on the mantle of leading this charge, and I'll make that happen. It doesn't take a big committee. As a matter of fact, a big committee is probably a really bad idea. Start with a single person that's willing to take up the flag, and then they'll gather people around them that can make that happen. But what I want to do for the next few minutes here till we finish up is to talk about how do you deliver, okay? Because it's one thing to have somebody plant the flag and say, let's get started, but how do you keep this going over time? How do you even develop it to a level of competence? Because right now, People don't know how to do it, and I can tell you you saw from the slides on Seaside that at the very beginning, what gets done is relatively incompetent, even with the best architects available at the time. If you look at any of the stuff that was done in those first few years, the architects that did those today they can show you work of theirs that is far better, because they've developed into something far more competent. Actually, they've gone beyond competence to excellence and even greatness in some cases. And so, but how do you carry that on? I would suggest that, now in Charleston they did it with Mayor Riley. Only problem is there's only one Joe Riley. Okay, there's nobody quite like him. And so if you depend on a single person to carry this thing on, once you've made the decision, some of you, to get it started, then hey, we all die. And so there'll come a time that single person won't be there anymore, or something will happen to him somewhere in between. I would suggest, now, again, I'm saying this as a person that writes these books, so take this with a grain of salt, okay? But if you have some kind of a document that puts out the vision, and not only the vision, but the mechanism of how to get it done, kind of the business plan of doing it, where you said, here's how you do this, here's how you do that, then that thing is more durable than any of us that die, because you can reprint stuff after. So you need some kind of an instrument that carries on wisdom beyond the tenure or office length, term in office or whatever, of any person in your building department or whoever the person may be. You need something to be able to carry that on. Now, I can talk for days about particulars of how that might happen, but I'd almost rather have a conversation rather than just sit up here and talking to y'all, because I don't know what's making sense. I don't know what the questions are or anything like that. So if we could spend a little time just kind of as a conversation rather than presentation, that would be good.
Got your ears covered? Right, there we go. Steve, what I do want to say a few words, because what I see is I have not been a heavy participant in the preservation world. How many people are really involved in historic preservation organizations and the like? Okay. What's one of the things that we know about historic preservation groups across the country, and that is that they have not, for the most part, done a great job of getting real young people involved. It is, the caricature is it's the little old lady club trying to save the old Victorian houses and things like that. And to me, I see that as a real shame, because I think the younger generation actually cares deeply about their neighborhoods, about their communities, and about beauty in their neighborhoods. And so what I've lobbied Steve to do, I was like, well, Steve, what you've got is the perfect thing, because you're not trying to create a historical, recreation of the past. You actually potentially have the information, the glue that brings the preservation groups, which are very passionate, with this younger generation, because I'd hate to see the preservation movement essentially die out because this younger generation just didn't take to it. So I don't know, I'd be curious about what other people think who are more active in preservation groups. Pat?
Steve, I'm a big fan of your pattern books, Post-Katrina.
Thank you.
And my office permits houses all day, every day, and I don't see any cottages, anything resembling the beautiful drawings that you've done that show our architecture pre-Katrina. So how do you get mass builders to use real architectural styles?
Okay, so how do you make it easier for builders to do it? Because I can tell you the pattern book alone, as it is does not make it easy enough. All right, and that's what I'm talking about, is you've got to take it another step, another level. Steve has done that as a town architect. Okay, but we can talk about the different tools that he uses, but he uses the pattern book, which is essentially the deposit, the repository for the principals. But then you get to the level of the builder, and what's the builder want to know? The builder wants, give me the construction detail of the eve detail options that I have here. I just need, or I need to frame a window. Steve, give me 5 different ways I can frame a window. And then you plug that in to his principle-based book that also takes you from the informal to the formal, the vernacular to the classical, and say, okay, well, these window construction details of how you frame a window, these are the 2 or 3 that you can do on the formal scale. Here's what you need on the informal scale. That begins to get you to the point where it is getting easy enough. But right now the answer is that it's too hard. It's too big of a step. It's like a big moat with alligators right there, and you can't jump over it right now. It's just, unless you're extraordinary. If you're an extraordinary builder, you can take his principles, you can take his book and do it. Otherwise, you need him sitting down with you as a developer in your community, making it happen. And so what he needs for a living tradition is get it beyond where he physically needs to live.
Well, and I'll tell you what, and that's been my goal for years, is to make myself unnecessary in the places that I work. And that happens. And I'll tell you what happens. There's billions of dollars riding on this in a collection of places. Until a builder understands why you do what you do in a certain way, that's not his normal way, then even if the good way has fewer pieces, takes less labor, all of that, it's going to get the custom price, because it's not what it normally does, and the standard crap is going to get the standard price. Okay, but just as soon as the builder understands why this is a better way of building for these regional conditions in climate and culture, then all of a sudden that's what they want to do, and that gets the standard price, and the normal crap gets the custom price because they don't want to do it anymore. Now, there was a place that Nathan and I worked a few years ago over in Alabama, and there was one builder that brought in to me one day a set of plans, and he said, he was kind of chuckling about it, and he said, Steve, and it was a totally normal McMansion, okay? And he unrolled the plans, and he said, there was a doctor here in town that wanted me to build this house. And I had to tell him, and he said it would have been a good fee, but I had to tell him, I just don't do that anymore. That's not what I love to do. And I love doing this other stuff because now I know why that's so good for here versus that being just normal everywhere. And so that actually does happen, that builders will do that. Now, once they do, then there's a good chance that if you have both the document and have started a living tradition, it can carry on its own, and the person who kind of planted the first seeds can leave and it'll still be okay. And so that's my hope, is to get to the point that we're regularly doing that, planting those seeds of a tradition and then letting it carry on, and kind of a Johnny Appleseed thing, plant seeds in many places.
But that's why I believe, and I'll do what I can to foster it in my region, is to get a locally adapted living tradition book of principles. It also then has the layer of construction details for the most common details to make it a little easier. And then we'll probably want to get to the point of actually having some building type examples that are already there, so I can, so it's not about requiring anybody in the community to do this. It's about saying, hey, here's a resource. This could be easy for you to really get something right that gets the premium that Steve's talking about. So what I'm going to be looking for is to find sources of funding and different partners who have something to gain from participating in that. Because I think one of the challenges right now is that, are you familiar with the living tradition Bahamas book, for example? Okay, so that was a brilliant innovation, but part of the problem is Steve. Okay, and the problem is that Steve is smarter than the rest of us. He doesn't think like some of the rest of us. He can balance so many more variables in his head that the complexity he can't see all that well. So that's why I say, and Juan's just laughing, but it's true. He's operating at a different level of complexity, and so when he sees that, he says, oh, this is easy. And I say, no, this is not easy, Steve. This may be brilliant, but to make it truly brilliant is you've got to make it easier to understand and use. So the content is basically there. It's out there and it's in his head and it's got all that. But if we can come up with this new product that actually is geared towards saying, okay, we are proud of our local community. We want to have a distinctive, approach to what our community looks like, what our built environment looks like in our community. We need something to document that. And then we need the people like me who can't handle the complexity as much. I'm going to say, okay, Steve, let's work with you to go ahead and document that. But it's not going to be just us paying you a fee to go do your book. We're going to be collaborative in this, and we're going to take the good work you've already done, and we're going to customize it for where we need to go, and we're going to get the different parties. We need to get the preservationists on board. We need to get the young folks in the community who are going to be living with it, for a while on board, and then move forward that way. So at least that's what I really love to see for our region, because our region is, it's almost as though almost everything that gets built in our community has nothing to do with our rich, unique culture, which is a shame, since that is clearly in our area the most valuable asset we have is our distinctive Creole Cajun culture.
And by the way, there is a secret weapon for uniting the young with the preservationists. Okay, and that is that if you really think about it, I don't know why this isn't obvious to everyone forever, but for a long time there's been these well-publicized feuds between the preservationists and the green builders, because somebody wants to demolish an old building and build a LEED platinum building or whatever. and so those battles have been well documented over the last several years. But if you really get down to it, preserving and sustaining, okay, preservation and sustainability are exactly the same thing. If you can't preserve it, you can't sustain it. It's gone. It's off the, it's in the landfill. So putting things in those terms, actually, where the young understand that the greenest brick is the one that's already in the wall, and then that all of a sudden taps into a lot of passion that they have for living sustainably in ways that are completely compatible with preservation. I don't know why that we haven't all realized this as a culture, 15 years ago, but it's time to realize it now.
The need to articulate why you should be doing this. That's one of the innovations just of his post-Katrina pattern books, is to say we do this because, articulate. There's no rule that doesn't have a reason behind it. And so to be able to articulate the reason why you do it and then make it easy to follow that principle that supports your community, I think that's the trick. Jeff?
Just to move on, preservation a minute. One of the things that I've been formulating in my head is that I think this idea, and you hear it very often, this idea that, but we need to do this more of its era, or it needs to be of its time. And I think, particularly for my, we talked a lot of demographics here, like the Generation X's and certainly those before us. We have in living memory, those who were connected to the original, the sign and the original modernists, the Le Corbusier and all of that whole group that sort of led the charge and came together and sort of set the agenda for where architecture was going to go in the modern era. And so, my grandfather was among, he was an architect, but he was amongst that crowd. So it's easy for us to not make that leap. That, well, that's not traditional. That's just what they set into motion. I think that with the new generation, though, I think it's becoming, with the millennials in particular, you don't necessarily have a living link to that group. And when you really get down to it, I think what's becoming obvious is that if your architecture, if you're emulating forms and a belief system from earlier generations, you are technically doing traditional work. And the question might arise as to why have we set the point in time at the earlier part of the last century? Why is it all these other things that were before that are somehow being taught away from us, or not? They're not in our toolboxes in our architecture schools. And so what you get is that you either get this sort of, those elements are being, we're starving those away from the architects until somebody says, wait a minute, I want a building with a gallery, and I want it with shutters. And then all of a sudden their hand is forced. You have to use this pattern book and do something before that era. And all of a sudden, the architects are having to be forced to learn this in a sort of a roundabout way, rather than having it part of their education system, the whole of tradition. So, you know, I think this idea of it being of its time is fine as long as of its time is considering a broader range of things in the past than just the past, you know, 100 years of architecture. And I really believe that, and I'm interested in what your sense of this is, but I've seen some articles coming out of, and some blogs coming out of the X generation that are saying, well, actually, even with preservation, the Xers are actually okay with, you know, some of the traditional architecture and with the modernist architecture, and they don't, that line is starting to blur. And I think that really what that means is that it's a huge opportunity for us. And in Lafayette, you know, what I'm looking at, you know, we've got Hayes Town was a famous architect who started off as a modernist and did some really marginal buildings in the oil center. But then just fabulous, just iconic Louisiana buildings that are culturally and climatically appropriate and very traditional. And you know, I just find that the opportunity now is that, you know, I want a building with a gallery on it, and maybe it has dormers, maybe it goes back to some of the French traditions, or maybe it goes back to some Spanish traditions, or maybe we pick up on some of these other traditions and do it in a very contemporary way. But having that ability to do the gallery, to do, you know, columns in different ways, how do you do a Juliet window in a very modern way? All those things, I think, are opportunities that I'm hoping that we will be able, through this effort, to inspire the younger, you know, architects, the budding architects, who are not affected by the dogma. They can actually say, wait a minute, you know, hey, I see a way forward of doing something really cool that harkens back to this whole broad tradition that is available to me to push forward into the future.
Let me talk about that for a minute. A couple of things. Number one, the idea of its time, it must be of its time, is one of the biggest red herrings that we face today. Okay, I've got a great image. I don't have it here, but it's an aerial shot from way up high, 30,000 feet or whatever, of a couple of mountain ridges running along, and you have this valley here and a valley here and a valley here, and that's kind of how we as architects treat time. And that it's kind of like, at this ridge point, there's a watershed going that way. It's kind of like it's everything before now, that if a drop of water falls there, it can never come into this valley, which is the now. Okay, and then of course the next valley is the future, the unknown, and we can't know what that's going to be either. And so we're basically, you want to talk about handcuffs? How about if you have to handcuff yourself to just right now? What would have happened if Steve Jobs would have said, okay, the Mac, that's fine, but we got to throw all that away, because that was then, this is now. We have to design something of our time, and our time is now, 1985 or whatever. And so we can't do that. We have to throw that all away and start all over. That's the biggest handcuffs of all time, is to say we're not allowed to learn from things that work. We must be allowed to learn from things that work. That which has been done a lot in the past is simply another way of looking at it. It's that which has been proven to work. Why do we not want to ever allow ourselves to use anything that's been proven to work? I don't even like talking about history, because like what you're saying a minute ago with some of the Spanish traditions or whatever, I don't even like talking about that, because once you do, it's, oh, well, that's in the past. No, that's stuff that's proven to work for here and for us. You know, what is more important than is it of its time is the question, is it of here and is it of us? Those are the really important questions. I mean, what is time? Time is numbers on a calendar and on a clock. Okay? I'm more worried about stuff that works. Let's do what works, and let's all agree to learn from each other. You know, if you did something last year that's really good, I want to know about it. It's last year. I don't care if it's last year. Your granddaddy did something. He's dead now, maybe. I don't know. But it was good. I want to know about it. Why should I not be allowed to know about what he developed that actually worked really well? You know, let's use stuff that works.
All right. What?
I'd like to make a comment.
Here you go.
I hate getting into all these arguments about architectural style, because I do agree that it needs to be of its place, and that the only way time really affects anything is the people that are doing it, like Steve said, the materials that are available at the time, and the politics of the time. One thing that is critical for cities, and it is a fact, that if you have a unique identity, that if people come to your town and they sense that, every single expert that's talked about this has shown those are the successful places. They're successful economically, socially, culturally. I mean, look at New Orleans. It's a hotbed of culture. And even our mayor does not even, in his list of what is culturally relevant in this town, architecture is not even mentioned, or urbanism. Now, why do people come here? Do they come here for the aquarium, or do they come here for, any of those other silver bullets? No. They come here to walk down one of the unnamed streets in Bywater or Uptown. They just want to be. They want to. That's why Airbnb is so successful here, because they want to be embedded in the neighborhood. They love it. And these are the places that are really difficult to find in this country, because every town is destroying them with sprawl. And we're allowing tear downs to happen rather than recycling and reusing these buildings in a responsible manner. Ocean Springs has got great character in downtown, what Gulfport does. But what do you see happening? Everywhere. It's just being destroyed. And it's just being thrown away. And there are whole conferences that are done on this. We had a fabulous one here put on by our preservation group it was on authenticity, authentic community. And the first guy that spoke was actually a landscape architect that talked about the cultural landscape. And architecture is just one component of that cultural landscape. It's the urbanism. Steve was here one time and talked about the stories that you can read in the community as you walk down the street, by the repetition of the stoops and the, not just the architecture, but other little details in the landscape. The squares and the public spaces and the size of the lots and the size of the blocks. But I think that's what we need to focus on. And I'm reminded too that when I was in Ventura, we're also having this discussion. And Santa Barbara, when it went through a major era, there was, I think, some fires or some other disruptive events that happened, but they had people come in and they completely reimagined that city, and it literally turned it around economically, and it is the most expensive place in all of California to live, Santa Barbara. And if you've ever been there, you know why. They chose a Spanish mission style, they put in a code, and they followed it. So the quality and the architecture really doesn't matter.
I'm going to say one thing real quick about preservation, then this hand up back there. But one thing real quick, and that is that the modern preservation movement arose because of the fact that for decades we've been replacing greater things with lesser things. Okay, for most of history there hasn't been much in the way of preservation movements. Occasionally in some really special places, but for the most part not, because we had a history for a long time of replacing something less with something better. I aspire to the time in the future when we actually get good enough again that we don't need preservation because we're doing better rather than doing worse, but that has not been our track record for all of my lifetime.
I cringe when a developer comes into town and says, oh, we're quality developers, we've done this 38,000 times. And I know what we're going to be looking at. On an incremental basis, we had AutoZone to come to Franklin. And we, in the city, worked with them to get them to change their design, their typical design. And I understand now it's the prototype that they're using in their chain. We did this with Jack in the Box. And they had the pagoda style. And the chairman of our planning commission said, no, I don't think so. It's the most visible intersection in Franklin. Changed a few things. He told them how to change it. He was a builder. We built some of those houses I was telling you. And now that too has become the prototype that they have used across the country. So even in the modern era and outside of downtown, we've been talking about suburbia, there are ways to influence that. And I think you've given us some inspiration for when we go home and work in the planning department to concentrate a whole lot more on design, and especially architectural design, because when I take our aldermen and our planning commissioners out and I show them the layout of the development, what they come back seeing is the architecture, whether they like it or not.
A couple of things real quick. You said it's really, really important. And you talked about incremental developing and also scale. Now, I believe in, whenever I can, criticizing my own people rather than somebody else, because I am one of them. One of the biggest problems of the new urbanism is that, at a small scale, like Seaside, it's only 60 acres for crying out loud. But the projects that have tended to be the least successful have been the very biggest ones. Okay, so the bigger chunks that we try to do, the less successful it almost always is. So the smaller increments you can break anything into, the better off you're going to be, in my opinion.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Steve. Appreciate your presentation.